and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest is John Sipher. He worked for the CIA clandestine service for 28 years. He's published in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and other media, and is now a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also a co-founder of Spycraft Entertainment. Welcome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Sergey.
So my first question is, we are facing now the development on the front line in Ukraine. We have political changes in Europe. We have pretty tough discussion in the US. Is Vladimir Putin losing this war as we all hoped, or are we entering just a new phase?
Yeah, that's a hard question. And on one sense, he certainly has already lost the war. You know, if you look at what he intended to happen in the larger scale of things, you can argue that, he's lost the war and he's continuing only in the sense that he has no other choice. Essentially, he's in a stalemate, he's stuck. The only thing he has is really hope. And so he can continue to throw Russian bodies into the mix in order to try to hope that something changes, either the United States politics change or Europe gets tired of the conflict, or there's pressure on Ukraine, or something happens. And so, the one thing we have to keep in mind is the pressure should stay on Vladimir Putin. He shouldn't be let off the hook, because he's walked himself into a corner here, and we should do our best to keep him there. But of course, at the same time, this means that Ukrainians are losing their lives. It means they're in a very difficult position. It's going to be harder and harder to push Russians out of Ukraine as long as they remain some version of a professional fighting force. So it's a very troubling time. There is pressure in the U.S. political system, and there is obviously pressure on the economies in Europe. And so we can say that Vladimir Putin has not won, but neither has Ukraine at this point.
How much this war is being run not only on the battlefield in Ukraine, but by secret services? We know that Budanov's, who is Ukrainian master chief spy of the military intelligence directorate, is one of the most popular persons in Ukraine, which one doesn't expect to be when you're a secret service chief. But it's not only him. What are the secret services doing in this war?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't want to talk about the secret services in the West to suggest that it isn't the Ukrainians who are bleeding and fighting and winning this war. But I think one thing that I think Vladimir Putin didn't take into account, and probably we in the West didn't either, is both the resilience and the talent of the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian intelligence services. So there's one thing, we saw here in the United States in 2016, our politics was not ready for Russian disinformation and malign influence and the things that sort of hit us. And so, we're seeing this subversion, having problems and creating issues here in the United States. And obviously it's doing the same in Europe. But one thing that the Ukrainians have known for a long time, and certainly since 2014 when the war really started, is they understand the Russians. They understand the Russian mentality. They understand the Russian Chekist past. They understand Vladimir Putin and how he tries to operate. So they weren't really afraid. I mean, I think there was a lot of assumptions of us in the West that, when Vladimir Putin turns his military and his intelligence services against Ukraine, they're not going to be able to handle it. There's going to be massive hacking, and the systems are going to go down, and that he's going to be able to get away with the kind of bullying and subversion that he's gotten away with for years and years. And it didn't work that way. And I think it's because people who live next to Russia, especially the Ukrainians who understand the Russians and speak Russian, they understand this. They were ready for this because they know, what a cold, calculating, nasty operator Vladimir Putin is. And so in a sense, Vladimir Putin, I think he thought he would have as much success with his secret services as he's had in other places in the West that were focused on other things. And it hasn't turned out that way. So yes, I think the Budanov and the military and the civilian intelligence services are doing a very, very good job. And I certainly hope that we in the West are assisting in any way we can. If we're not going to send fighters to fight, we need to provide as much intelligence support as we can. Yeah.
But Vladimir Putin seems to be more successful with his intelligence services in the West, in particular in Germany, compared to his successes in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's because the Ukrainians knew what to expect and understand the Russian mindset and mentality. we in the West, I mean, in Germany, for example, there's, there for years and years, there's focus that the world is moving in the right direction and it's moving away from this sort of old dog eat dog type of, mentality that Vladimir Putin has. We in the United States are focused on the war on terrorism, and we're focused on, dealing with China and all these other issues. And, Russian malign influence was just sort of seen as, something that was sort of a small thing that we didn't have to pay much attention to. That, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was just something that was going to sort of move its way naturally into sort of becoming slowly a Western country. Now, of course, the Ukrainians and others knew very well that that wasn't the case, and they knew that they had to keep up their guard. And Vladimir Putin is a career Chekist. He's always been involved in trying to, use secret and bullying and subversion techniques. And so the Ukrainians, I think, were probably better poised to deal with this. And what I hope is that we in the West, certainly in Germany and the United States, start to develop some defenses and understanding of this. I mean, I worked in CIA for a long time, and those of us who worked on Russia understood the Russian Chekist, intelligence mentality and the way they think. But frankly, when we worked and tried to work with the German services, they wanted nothing of it. They essentially saw the Russians as sort of, if not allies, at least partners to be worked with. That this was sort of an old-fashioned way of thinking, and frankly, they were unhelpful to Western intelligence services in dealing with Russia.
That is like scary to hear that. And I'm, as a German citizen, I also feel like not in the bad position, like to say, oh, please don't say like anything bad about Germany. I know that there is indeed a lot of problems within the German society, but how can you explain it? Why were they ignorant? Didn't they want to believe it? Or is like the World War II past, or some sort of guilt feeling, or corruption, or what could be a reason for that?
Well, I don't have a full answer for that, but all intelligence services work for their political masters. And I think, politicians in Germany for a long time were focused on, building a strong and resilient economy. They were, moving towards, EU integration and all these other issues, and assumed falsely that Russia was going to, if we worked hand in hand with Russia and built an economy that worked with Russia, that Russia would come around, and it didn't. And so I think the BFV was talented in its own way. Early years of working terrorism, they fumbled and weren't so good, but eventually got better. But the BND was always unhelpful, and I think they thought they knew Russia better than everyone else, and they thought that they didn't need to work with other Western intelligence services on this issue. And I just hope, I'm obviously out of government now, I have no sense anymore, but I really hope that has changed, because obviously Russia is not going to stop its malign activities. It's going to continue to try to weaken us from within. And Germany is the key to Europe. And if Germany is weakened from within and its politics don't stand up to Russian aggression, then Europe is doomed, especially if things change in the United States and Donald Trump wins another presidential term.
Well, for those who listen to us, like BFV is practically internal counterintelligence institution, and BND is an intelligence institution which looks for information abroad. Please correct me if I'm wrong in this like very simplistic explanation. But what happened, like when you came to BND and say, guys, look, we have that and that problem in Russia, these developments bothers me. What was their answer? Just like, no, we believe Russians, they will not do anything bad to us. Or what did they say?
Well, I think there was obviously people in intelligence services that wanted to help, that did understand the problem, but there was also an arrogance there that they thought they knew better, that, their relationship with Russia would sort of protect them, and that they didn't need to work with the British or Americans or French or others on this issue. At least this is during my time. And some friends who obviously worked in Germany at the time, I think they found that the German services were very unhelpful on dealing with Russia. And again, I can't totally explain that. And I believe and hope that it's changed. And a lot of it has to do with political leadership. If the political leadership has come around to realize they need to defend themselves better against Russia, then the security services will follow along.
Could you imagine that some German security services, some German intelligence services were infiltrated by the Russian spy? Did that affect somehow sharing of information between intel agencies?
Well, all intelligence agencies are trying to, infiltrate and run spies inside. And obviously, Germany is the key country in Western Europe. And so therefore, the Russian intelligence service is going to focus very heavily on running spies inside Germany. Vladimir Putin obviously considers himself a German expert. He worked in East Germany during the Cold War, and he understands. And so they're going to be trying a wide variety of things, of trying to push money into the political system to support, bad actors. They're going to be trying to, create chaos and use disinformation and subversion. But they're also going to be, sometimes using their intelligence services to run spies inside. And I think there's been a number of spies that have been outed just in the recent years inside Germany. And we in the United States aren't immune to that either. We've had some very, very damaging Russian spies that we've uncovered over the years. And so, yes, I think the German security services have suffered from not taking the threat seriously, and also being penetrated by the Russians, so that it would be very difficult to even turn around quickly and deal with the Russian threat.
Does it also affect other countries in Europe, like also non-NATO countries like Austria, or NATO countries in the Central Europe, like Czechia or Poland?
That's right. I can only talk about we in CIA trying to work with partners on the Russian target, and countries like Czech Republic were always very helpful. Poland was always very helpful. Austria, it's difficult because there's so much Russian money in Austria, and they have such a small security apparatus and service. And so even if, and it's very political, so it changes. So when a new politician comes in, the security services often, the leadership and others often change. And so even if there was people in that sort of professional security services of Austria that understood the Russian threat, they didn't really have the resources or the political cover to really do much about it. But from my experience, we worked very well with countries like Spain and Czech Republic and Poland and Britain and France and the Nordic countries on Russia issues. But for some reason, Germany was an outlier.
This actually, reminds me on the discussion before the full-scale invasion of Russia in February 22, when the British planes, which were transporting NLAW anti-tank guided missiles to Ukraine, they had to fly around Germany because Germany was too slow to provide flight permission for dangerous goods through the German airspace. And there was absolutely no understanding in Germany that Russia would attack. Chancellor Scholz visited Moscow just 2 weeks before the Russian full-scale invasion. When he came back to Germany, then his party cheered him as a person who brought peace with his diplomacy. We all know that it didn't happen. This decision of German government, was it because they didn't want to believe in what was pretty obvious, or because they were misinformed by their agencies, or because they knew it will happen, but they believed it makes no sense to stay in the way of the Russian army and stop the Russian army because it's unstoppable?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I also know that we in the United States, for example, have misunderstood and misplayed Vladimir Putin for the last 20 plus years. And so we've had multiple presidents and administrations who thought if they just sort of, didn't push back against Putin and they let him go, and that he would come around, he would change, he would slowly move towards a Western mindset. If he bullied and pushed and did something, rather than, punish him in the diplomatic or military sense, we just would sort of let it go and hope for the best. And so Germany is not alone in sort of creating this problem. You can argue that Vladimir Putin, in some sense, there was a logic to his view about going into Ukraine. He'd gone into Ukraine in 2014 and there was no penalty or pushback. And he had gone into Moldova, and he'd gone into Georgia, and he had, pushed back against us, and he had committed murders in our countries, and he had, done this variety of things, shot down airplanes, all sorts of things, and really never was pushed back by those of us in the West. He looked at NATO and saw it as sort of weak or divided. He probably saw Germany as not a serious threat. He thought he had spent money on trying to create, capture of elites and bankers and business people and even politicians throughout Europe. He was creating discord inside the United States, inside US politics, the whole Trump administration was in some ways very pro Putin, which is just crazy. And then of course the U.S. pullout of Afghanistan, showed weakness. And so to him, he must have thought, all of these things come together, which show that the West will really do nothing if I go into Ukraine. And frankly, it's great that we have pulled together. NATO is re-strengthened. I think Germany has come around. I think we're all trying to do our best to send weapons and support, a democratically elected Ukrainian government against, this kind of aggression. And so, there's a lot of blame to go around in the lead up here. And Germany certainly deserves some of it, but so does the US, frankly.
But when we are talking about how can we predict what Vladimir Putin would do, you saw that for many people, especially for the Ukrainian intelligence agencies, it was clear that Russia would attack Ukraine. Some didn't want to believe it. But now, like after almost 2 years of this war, can we predict what is going on in Russia? Can we have reliable sources of information there and be able to analyze them and come to right conclusions?
Wow, that's the $24 million question. That's such a hard thing. It's always been hard to understand the mentality of the Kremlin. It's just so different from the Western mentality. And Vladimir Putin has created a system that's almost like a mafia organization where the people who are in power and the people who are rich are such because he's allowed them to be, and they have to provide some sort of support to the Kremlin in that process. And so there's always this issue of who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. The whole Prigozhin issue showed us that, it's hard to know that, he got away with all kinds of things that other people couldn't get away with because he was part of the inner circle until, of course, he was then, murdered eventually. And so it's very difficult to understand.
By the way, this
Russian,
Prigozhin story, can you say like if the Western intelligence agencies knew that Prigozhin would try to revolt, or was it a surprise for most of them?
I don't know the answer to that. I haven't been in the service recently, but I think, if you were being objective, there was enough information out there about Prigozhin and what he was pushing at. And I'm sure that both, our services and others had that ability to look at least their communications and see, at least get a heads up of what was happening here. But to understand how Putin would react to it, I don't know that that's something that we in the West would have a good handle on. Like it's hard to know in that kind of system where Vladimir Putin, has people around him. He never knows who's going to stand up and who isn't going to stand up. And so when Prigozhin came in to southern Russia on his way up to Moscow, I'm sure there was an issue of, okay, well, if I call out the military, will they support me? Will they support Prigozhin? Who is loyal? Who's not loyal? When you're in that sort of mafia run kind of organization, it's all about loyalty, and loyalty can change on a dime. And so it's a very difficult thing for us in the West to understand. And they've spent 100 years or more, and certainly decades, creating a security system to try to keep the regime in power and protect the regime from outside intelligence influence. So when I worked in Moscow, and it's no different today, it was a massive amount of security to try to make sure that our diplomats and our intelligence officers could not get real information. So I had audio and video inside my house. I had surveillance every single time I walked out on the street. Everybody I talked to was questioned. I was followed with people, cars, dogs. They would use chemical tracking agents. They would do all these kind of things to make sure that we can't meet people who could give us really inside information. Now, we in the West, I think, have learned and have been successful over time of still finding sources inside the system. And we spend a ton of money on everything from satellites to technical gear to human intelligence to try as best we can to understand and decipher the Russian sort of mentality and the Kremlin mentality. But admittedly, it's very hard. It's very different. And anybody that tells you they know what's going to happen is lying to you, I think.
But let me put it into the way that I'm, as a person who has like no experience of this kind, like tries to understand. So when you are posted in such non-democratic country like Moscow with like absolutely paranoid dictatorship government, you are dependent on different sources of information, but with the lack of information, with the censorship, and with the level of control which you have described, like you don't get any, not even primary but also secondary information. Vladimir Putin is, as we know, is discussing things in a very close circle of like maybe 3, 5 people, and nobody knows what he will do next. So you need to rely on some sort of secondary information, like the traffic level in the city or something, but they can lie to you or you can misinterpret them. How can you deal with that situation?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's very difficult. So you do your best to try to use as many resources as possible. So you're using academics that travel back and forth in those relationships. You're using diplomatic relationships. You're using our military attachés that do things. We're using satellites. We're using technical gear. We're using sensitive and expensive ways to sort of try to collect communications and other kinds of gear information and put it all together. And we do run some sources. It's very, very difficult to run sources in Russia, but there's lots of Russians who have pieces of the puzzle, who live overseas, who might understand. They might believe that the regime is doing harm to Russia. They may love Russia, but they think Putin is doing damage to them. They might have interests in their family or something moving out, and so they might provide us information, a piece of the puzzle. And a subset of those people may be willing to risk everything, but to go back in and meet Western intelligence officials, secretly in a very carefully prepared way, so that nothing is ever seen, either through technical communication or even meeting, after a huge effort in an alley somewhere to provide some information. And so it's a matter of putting all those things together. And even then, you're right, it's an incomplete picture, because Putin is from this mentality. He's from the mentality of the KGB, which is about their job is to keep the regime in power at all costs, which means that they make sure there's no political opposition. There's nobody who can be threaten the regime. Anybody who wants to get information that can potentially subvert the regime is either arrested, killed, or pushed aside. Foreigners who need to understand and want to understand the system are followed, tracked, and are provided with sometimes false information. So it's a very, very difficult issue to understand, and always has been, frankly. And so the U.S. puts a lot of resources in doing our best to understand that, but nonetheless, we're going to be surprised over time, and we have been.
When we rely on statistic data, I think that could be one of the explanations why Russian army was such strongly overestimated compared to what they performed. We believe that the data they deliver, they're correct, or they're partly correct, or mostly correct. Then we see the reality. Does Vladimir Putin himself know what is going on in his army? I'm pretty sure he did not want to start this war expecting like 20 months of war. He wanted to have a fast victory, which was impossible to achieve.
Well, this is the product of the system. So you create a system that's built on corruption, where you don't necessarily, the best and the brightest don't win jobs. The best and the brightest don't create companies. There's not private thing. You have to be loyal to the Kremlin. So yeah, I'm sure that people came to him and told him that, our new tank or missile system is, state of the art. But of course, in that process, everybody in the chain that built that new system took a cut of money or is corrupt in some way. And so, and any kind of time a dictator is in power for that long, and the punishment for being seen to undercut the dictator is, again, jail, death, or being essentially pushed aside, ability to not make a living. You're going to eventually get people telling you what you want to hear. You're going to have a small cadre of insiders whose reason for staying alive and being rich is the Kremlin, and they're not about to tell him that he's making a mistake and this is wrong and everything is messed up. And of course, he also doesn't. It's similar to the Soviet days. You want to have a powerful military, but you don't want them to be so powerful or have powerful leadership that could threaten your leadership. And so he put someone like Shoigu in charge of the military. Shoigu was never in the military. He doesn't know those kind of things. He's I'm sure he's mildly competent, but he's not the best and the brightest of that system. but he needs somebody like that who's loyal. The loyalty to him and fear of him is more important than being competent at your job, and that he could push him aside at any time because he doesn't want to, any kind of internal or political threats to himself. You put all those things together of being lied to over the years because no one wants to tell you the truth because there's no upside in learning the truth, a system that's sort of corrupt at its roots, and putting sort of people that are loyal rather than competent in charge, and you're going to have what we saw in 2022.
But does it mean that, after all, corruption and authoritarian style of rule are serving now the free world because Russian army cannot fight as it should have fight it, or as they believe they would fight?
Yeah, I mean, for example, the group Bellingcat that's done incredible reporting inside Russia, they take advantage of the corruption and the sloppiness and stuff. So Vladimir Putin believes he's created a tight nest of people who are totally loyal to him, but the system below that relies on sort of corruption and people paying each other off and all of these kind of things, and sort of staying out of the way. And so, Bellingcat can look and try to find databases and sources of information by just paying people at a lower level to give them telephone records or records of, automobile licenses or things, and start to use big data to put that together, and can create a very accurate picture of what's happening there. So you add that to the intelligence piece, trying to look from top down with these kind of, use of corruption to look at things from the bottom up, and you start to get a better picture of the system. And I think, yeah, I mean, what we're going to have to do, we meaning you, us, the West, is find those weaknesses and try to take advantage. That's what Russia has been doing against us in the West. It's almost like it's asymmetric warfare. It's the warfare of a terrorist group. They can't take you on head on, so they try to look for weaknesses to exploit. And that's what Vladimir Putin and the KGB before him have always tried to do. They look for weaknesses in our system and take advantage of them. In the United States, they can use social media freely and spread false information because our system, we have a First Amendment that doesn't allow us to censor things or whatever. So Vladimir Putin says, oh, that's a weakness. I'm going to use that and against the United States. And it's created real problems for us. But now we're seeing where the weaknesses are in the Russian system, and we need to be equally aggressive in terms of taking advantage of those weaknesses.
What would be for you the first sign when you say, okay, now Russia has lost the war, it starts to collapse?
Yeah, it's so hard to predict collapse, and what does collapse mean? I think in Vladimir Putin's mind, it's him being in power. In other words, he is Russia, and therefore, his loss of power is existential and the most important thing. And so, there's a variety of things. If the troops start to turn and run, if there's a rout, then there's going to be people sort of somewhere in that system that realize, yes, we're loyal to Vladimir Putin as long as the system in the country is strong. But if it looks like we're being humiliated and embarrassed, maybe something should change. He's created that system of people around him that he either keeps in fear or loyal or paid off. And you saw with Prigozhin, there's always a chance that there's, people around him could change. And, countries that rely on fear to keep in power, they fear their people. And so they don't tell them real information. They keep them down. They keep them scared. But, you saw in Germany, East Germany probably had the most powerful internal security system in the history of the world. The Stasi had spies everywhere inside, even families and things. And nobody would challenge the system in any way because there was no upside. If you challenge the system, you would be crushed until something starts moving and the fear goes away. And once that happens, then the people actually have power. So people don't have power in Russia now. People didn't have power in East Germany. But if a system starts to fray and changes, it can change really quickly. We've seen it in Libya. We've seen it in Georgia. We've seen it in Ukraine, frankly, as well. And so Russia could change. I don't know that we're going to know how to do it or when it's going to happen, but I think he understands and he fears it. That's why, he cracks down so harshly on any kind of potential political threat. I mean, look at Navalny. Navalny had what, 1%, 2% support in the system, and he believed it was critical to constantly harass him and maybe even kill him and jail him. like, that shows fear of your own people to me. And, that shows that he understands that there's a threat to him and that he needs to keep, his system, really pressed down. And which also suggests that it could change.
But if we start to talk about the Russia's military defeat in Ukraine, for many, Russia's military defeat can trigger some sort of irreversible political change in Russia, which can lead to separation of Russia into several regions, which could pose no threat to Ukraine because they will not have like some imperial ambitions and imperial heritage. But if we look at Germany, for example, in Germany, the idea of collapse of Russia and disintegration of Russia seems maybe as even more dangerous development than the continuation of imperial Russia in more or less like democratic and cooperative way. Like we were dealing with Vladimir Putin for 20 years, it was good, so we can deal with the next one for 20 years. Where is the golden way to make the world a safer place and to secure stability without like falling into support for some imperial ideas?
Yeah, this is a hard thing, and this is also shows how awful it is what Vladimir Putin has unleashed here, not only for himself and for Russia, but for all of us, because now we have to worry that a disintegrating Russia could be a danger to the West, as well as a strong Russia under Vladimir Putin. I mean, Gorbachev died recently, and I was in Russia sort of as the Soviet Union was falling apart, and shortly thereafter in the 90s and things. And in some ways, there was a concern that as the Soviet Union was falling apart, that it could be like a Yugoslavia situation where it became, horrible, horrible internal civil war. And we largely avoided that. There's obviously deaths in Georgia and in Lithuania and elsewhere, but it didn't go into a sort of a massive, horrible civil war. But what
was this fear like illogical? Was it like there were no proofs that the republics of Soviet Union will start to war each other? Maybe only Armenia, Azerbaijan because of Karabakh, but who could imagine that Ukraine would invade Moldova, or Belarus would invade Lithuania, or Estonia would invade Latvia? Like this fear existed only in the heads of some Western politicians, or was it not?
That's probably true. But you don't know when a country like that starts to disintegrate. I mean, it's the same with Yugoslavia. Did you expect that the Croats would, or the Serbs would go into Croatia, or that Slovenia would, or the Serbs would go into Slovenia? And so it's a difficult thing, and it's obviously a concern. But and you see now that that Western leadership now is focused on it here. It's like, well, maybe if we push Vladimir Putin too far, then that could lead to disintegration in Russia, and that's such a strange and difficult game. I mean, we overemphasize what our ability to do, like our ability to either do something that will ensure that Russia doesn't disintegrate, or our ability to do something to ensure that Putin will leave, but somebody else will come. I don't think we have that ability. We've seen, we haven't been able to even do those things in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's going to be Russians and people in the area that are going to be the ones that answer how this all works. And I think maintaining strong Western relationships, maintaining a strong NATO, putting pressure on Vladimir Putin, who is the person who is creating this imperial and horrible war, is the best we can do now. And then, based on what happens in Russia from Russians, then we're going to have to respond to that. But the notion that we can somehow perfectly choreograph this to happen so that Ukraine doesn't lose, but Russia doesn't lose too much, or that if Putin leaves, he leaves peacefully, or that we keep stability there, those aren't things I think we can control. I think what we can control is supporting Ukraine as it defends itself.
When the German Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz denies Ukraine Taurus missiles, is it because of his wish of like this perfect choreography, or is it something else?
I think it's some of that, and it's also this sort of what I think is irrational fear of Russian escalation, and that is something that Vladimir Putin and the Russians have cleverly put into place. They've used threats of nuclear weapons. They've used threats of of escalation. They've used this sort of bullying for the last several decades, that every time an issue would come up, whether it was a 2014 invasion, whether it was in Georgia or otherwise, they would sort of heighten the rhetoric, they'd threaten things, and we would all sort of back off and say, oh, it's not worth, pushing back against Russia. But every time you give a bully or you give a criminal, you back off and let them go, they see that as weakness that can be exploited, and they move forward. I think one, quote unquote, good thing that could come out of this is now we realize with Vladimir Putin that there's nothing good to be done about appeasing him and giving him what he wants. He needs to be defeated. And I think in Germany in leadership, and it's easy for me because I'm not a leader of a country to say that, these threats of nuclear war are used to try to make us back off and be afraid. I don't see that there's any military or political benefit for Vladimir Putin to actually use a nuclear weapon. If he uses a nuclear weapon, Ukraine's not going to give up. China might pull its support from Russia. It might bring potentially NATO troops more into defending, Ukraine against Russia. So there's no really. I think this blustering and bullying has benefited him for over the years because we back off. And so I don't know, but when Schultz or when our White House doesn't want to give, to this kind of system rather than that kind of system, or we don't want to give too many tanks or whatever, I think it's this notion that we want to calibrate, that we don't give too much so that Russia then, escalates. But, we have a history here where, Russia, they understand strength and they respond to strength. If we just move back a period of months, they were telling us that anybody joining NATO, certainly Finland or Sweden, was existential, and that would, lead to war. And they both joined NATO and nothing happened. I don't think Russia has, many, many more cards to play, and therefore we should be helping Ukraine do the best it can to defend itself and throw Russia out of Ukraine, and stop worrying so much that, if I give 10 things, it might be okay. But if I give 20, that means, oh my God, Putin's going to do something. I don't find that, terribly good logic.
Vladimir Putin attacked Ukraine anyway, despite the fact that Ukraine was de facto neutral. And I was talking recently with a German-Austrian expert, Gustav Gressel, who said you cannot micromanage war. You cannot say, okay, I sent 25 tanks, but not 30, or I sent like only 20 missiles, but don't use them outside of Ukraine, etc. But if we look at the outcome of this war, Ukraine wins its war, comes back to its sovereign territory, borders. How can we organize this space the way that we will not face the new war in 5 years, in 7 years, when the next Shoigu just comes with the next batches of tanks from China or from whatever else?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know. I mean, Russia's history is not one that suggests they're going to change. Now, we can hope, like we did the last 20 years or the last 30 years, that if we engage with them, it will change and be better. But I was a good article today in today's New York Times about Finland joining NATO and Finland's self-defense forces, and they've said, for their whole history, is, we live next to Russia, we need to work with Russia, but Russia is also a threat. And throughout its history, it's sometimes had decent relationships, but other times they've had this imperial aggression, and therefore we need all of our citizens to be, ready in case of war. And so, all men have to go through preparation to join the military. They have massive artillery. They're sort of ready to go to war. And so sadly, I think what's going to have to happen is NATO is going to have to get more serious about sort of just basic self-defense against Russia. That, there was an assumption after the Cold War ended that, okay, NATO would be more of a political bloc, and that, we could, use force in places like Afghanistan or other, but the threat from Russia was something that was diminishing. And I think in the future, we can't assume that. Now, we can take action to try to make sure that, maybe if Ukraine, Russia didn't attack Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania because they are part of NATO. Maybe in the future we have to make sure that places like Ukraine have enough connections to Europe, whether it's NATO or EU and stuff, to make the calculations of a new Russian leader, more difficult to make. That by taking action, he might be taking action against a much larger and more powerful group than just one of his neighbors. It was George Kennan, which is our most famous diplomat from the Cold War, always said that if you live on Russia's borders, in the Russian eyes, you're always a vassal or an enemy. You can't be anything else. And so if you don't want to be one, you're going to be the other. And so it's sort of it's the Russian mindset. It's not going to change. It hasn't changed for several hundred years. And so I don't think we should assume it's going to change anytime soon.
Well, that is a perfect assessment. In Russian eyes, you're either vassal or enemy, and the only way to survive is to be militarized and well trained, like Finland, or like other countries which are bordering Russia and have this history and know the enemy. And we will look what will come in the next months and years. Thank you so much. It was John Sipher, who worked for the CIA clandestine service for 28 years, also in Moscow. He's published in New York Times, Washington Post, and other media, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he was with us. He's the co-founder of Spycraft Entertainment. Thank you for your assessment. Thank you for your insight, John. And don't forget to subscribe, to like this channel, to share, and wait for the new interviews. Thank you, John Sipher.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. It was enjoyable.